Hey everybody, and welcome to Database Camp. In today's video, I'm going to be continuing my reading of Racism in America. So hopefully you guys are a bit familiar now with this series, but if you're not, make sure to check out the first introductory video that I did on this series. It goes further into detail about the book, what inspired me to do this reading on my channel, and also I read the foreword in that first video, so I'm going to link that one down below if you want a little bit more background. And also, I always forget to mention, well, not always, I'm getting better at it, but I want you guys to know that the book that I'm reading is actually free. It's available for free to download. You could download it in a PDF format. I think there's 2 other formats, but if you're interested in reading this book on your own time for yourself, I'm going to also be putting the link to the free ebook down below in the description box. So make sure to get your hands on that as well. So I'm going to be doing the 8th excerpt today in this video, and it's titled Bengali Harlem and the Lost Histories of South Asian America by Vivek Bald. So a little bit of background. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Bengali Muslims quietly joined some of America's most iconic neighborhoods of color. As steel and auto workers in the Midwest, as traders in the South, and as halal hot dog vendors in Manhattan. They created lives that challenge assumptions about assimilation and cross-racial affinities. Here, Vivek Bald recounts the cross-country travels of Dada Amir Haider Khan, a seaman from Kashmir, who in 1918 deserted his grueling life on a British steamship. He hoped to find a better way in America, where he stayed until 1926. But what he found was a political awakening. By the time an Indian seaman reached the waterfront of New York, Philadelphia, or Baltimore, he had already gone through a kind of transformation. Most had spent their early lives in rural areas far from the ocean before making their way to Calcutta and Bombay. They had often spent months in these cities' crowded docklands and then weeks, months, or years working at sea in the company of men from their own and other villages and regions, as well as moving in and out of large bustling cosmopolitan port cities across the globe. Alexandria, Naples, Tunis, London, Liverpool, Glasgow, Antwerp, Kobe, Shanghai, Singapore. The decision to jump ship in a northeastern port to escape the inequities of the British maritime trade and break the immigration laws of the United States was itself the sign of a confidence that for many would have grown over their time spent in the maritime trade. Many would have witnessed and been encouraged by other seamen who had developed knowledge about moving on and off ships as they docked in different places, or who had told of the opportunities and networks that awaited deserters on shore. But what happened to these seamen once they jumped ship to the United States? What happened to their sense of self, their sense of possibility, and their sense of the world once they entered the space of U.S. port cities and factory towns as workers, as migrants, and as men of color in a society deeply divided by race and class? This is a question that cannot be answered for most of the Indian seamen who deserted in U.S. ports in the 1910s and 1920s. There are likely as many answers to the questions as there were men who jumped ship, and now, years after this generation has passed away, there is little record of their experiences, let alone of the changes they underwent. The vast majority of these men were non-literate, and those who were literate appear to have had little opportunity or inclination to record their stories in writing. There is, however, one remarkable exception, the memoir of Dada Amir Hadir Khan, the first volume of his Chains to Lose, was written from a British Indian jail cell between 1939 and 1942. After Khan had been imprisoned for his activities in the independence movement and his organizing work for the Communist Party of India. More than 400 pages long, it details the early part of Khan's life, from his birth in a small village in northwestern Kashmir to his years as a teenage coal trimmer on British steamships. Through the period of his life, from 1918 to 1926, that Khan spent moving into, out of, and across the United States. In this relatively short period, he worked as a member of the American Merchant Marine, with New York as his home port, as a boilermaker in a railway workshop near Buffalo, New York, and as an auto worker in Detroit, Michigan. He rode the rails in the segregated South, earned certification as a steam engineer via a correspondence course, and became a licensed pilot after attending an aviation school in rural southern Illinois. Khan's memoir is perhaps the only existing first-hand account of the life and movements of an Indian maritime worker in the United States before the 1930s. Dada Khan was exceptional in many ways. He possessed a boldness and intolerance for injustice that led him to challenge superiors and organize fellow workers on British ships from the time he was just 16 years old, and then to plunge himself into the political landscape of cities such as New York and Detroit in his 20s. By the time he was 26, he had been recruited by representatives of the Communist International in the United States and sent to Moscow to train and study. As exceptional as he was, and as singular as some of his experiences were, Dada Khan's story is important because it illuminates so many different aspects of the history of Indian seamen in the United States, and it moves through so many of the spaces these men inhabited. As Khan recounts his movements and observations, we gain a first-hand account of the lives that Indian seamen forged for themselves throughout the networks they set up in U.S. port cities and industrial towns. Khan describes his time on and near the New York City waterfront, encountering recruiters and middlemen, working on ships with Indian crews, mixed crews, and white crews, laboring in factories in New Jersey, upstate New York, and Michigan, living with other Indian seafaring men, congregating in restaurants, laundries, and rooming houses, attending political meetings in ships' quarters, hotels, and Baptist churches. Khan's story gives us a sense of how different were the pathways through which Indian ex-seamen moved after jumping ship in the United States, compared to the smaller number of Indian elites, students, intellectuals, and professionals, who lived in the United States during the Asian exclusion era, and the much larger numbers who arrived after 1965. As racialized and criminalized workers, Indian maritime deserters inhabited different spaces on shore. They encountered different people, ideas, difficulties, and challenges. As a result, they were presented with different possibilities for reimagining themselves as social, cultural, and political actors, and this was what Dada Khan's memoir illuminates so clearly. Amir Hadir Khan and the other Indian seamen who jumped ship in the United States during this period also occupied a realm of work and everyday life that set them apart from elite radicals and introduced them in a more immediate way to the realities and often the violence of American racism. While Khan's entry into Indian nationalist politics is central to his narrative, his account of his developing consciousness around race and racism is equally significant. Although this parallel awakening had a longer arc, it was a crucial part of his experience in the United States. In the U.S. Merchant Marine and in his transformation from coal passer to revolutionary. Khan's writing about race is striking in its honesty, particularly as he assesses, after the fact, his own blind spots in his regard for African Americans and in his understanding of anti-black racism. Over time, Khan came to recognize that his nationalism was at the root of his blindness, that because his rejection of British subjecthood was predicated upon an embrace of the United States as a land of freedom and opportunity, he was unable to see the negative aspects of American society that were right in front of him. This changed over time, as Khan witnessed racial injustices and experienced them himself, and as he and other Indian ex-seamen lived near and among working-class African-American migrants in Detroit at a time of major political mobilization in the black community. Khan's account of his shifting consciousness around race is largely written in a reflective past tense in which he simultaneously records the instances of racial injustice, large and small, that he witnessed after jumping ship in the United States in 1918, and notes his often inadequate responses to or understanding of these events at the time they occurred. A striking example came early on in his career as an engine room worker on American vessels. In the fall of 1918, the ship on which he was working, which was en route from New York to Saint-Nazaire, France, to deliver supplies to U.S. troops, struck a rock in the shallows outside Saint-Nazaire and began taking on water. The barges that arrived to save the ship, Khan writes, brought pumps to keep the ship from sinking, along with groups of Negro Army workmen who were sent into the icy water deep inside the hold of the sinking ship to salvage its cargo. Khan watched as these black men, at the instruction of their white overseers, would fish out pieces of cargo night and day. This process continued for 2 months, even after the end of hostilities. Though Christmas is the biggest holiday in the United States, Khan remarks, there was no relief from the ceaseless toil of the Negro workers, whose bodies had become numbed by continuously working in cold weather and using the same wet overalls without any change. While standing nearby, I heard a Negro sergeant complain on behalf of his men that they were ready to collapse from exhaustion. His white overseer threatened that the slightest hesitation would result in punishment. Although the war had ended, the harsh treatment of the Negroes who were among the U.S. expeditionary forces in France did not improve. Khan was equally struck by the way U.S. military officials imposed American racial hierarchies upon the French port cities where American forces were concentrated, noting that while in French cities like Paris, one could often see Negroes, Chinese, or men of other colonial nationalities accompanied by French ladies in the most fashionable shops and cafes. In Brest and Saint-Nazaire, the Americans compelled the French to segregate the American Negroes, and all the local businesses, including restaurants, catered only to whites. The Negroes were allowed only into some of the ugliest back street dumps. At this stage, however, Khan did not appear to have been moved beyond the act of observing and remembering, and in fact admits to having been infected by American racism himself. Having caught cold while his ship was docked in Brest, Khan was sent to an army hospital onshore. Here, because of his dark skin, he was put in the black medical ward that U.S. authorities had set up. But instead of protesting the segregation in principle, Khan sought to be reassigned. Seeing that they had me put in a Negro ward, I did not want to stay and told the nurse I was really not that sick. She reported this is the admitting doctor who probably sensed the real reason for my refusal to stay. He asked me where I was born, and I replied I was born in India. He instructed that I be put in a ward with whites and told me that I should remain in the hospital for treatment. This I was now quite content to do, and I received very good care. Writing more than 20 years later, Kahn used this episode to illustrate that American racism often takes the form of a contagious disease. Accounting for his own actions and attitudes in these naturalized terms, even I, whose skin was not much fairer than the average Negro, had subconsciously been infected by a superiority complex within a few months of my arrival in the United States. Though I knew absolutely nothing of the country and could not even speak its language, over the next few years, Kahn's response to repeated personal experiences of racism in the American merchant marine would continue to take this form. He attempted to disassociate himself from African Americans and prove his worth as a seaman to his white American shipmates, while explaining away these shipmates' racism through the metaphor of disease, or being infested with the germ of this peculiar psychological illness. However, Kahn's attempts to explain away racism as an anomaly rather than a central figure of American society eventually began to break down. Amid a post-war slump in shipping, Kahn writes, the American Legion and Ku Klux Klan gained increasing influence among white American seamen. Now he experienced one incident after another in which white crew members shunned him the minute he stepped on board a new ship. Although his response was to work even harder once on board, to gain the respect of these racist shipmates, to help them overcome their illness, he reached a breaking point in 1922, when assigned by the shipping board in New York to an outgoing steamer, he experienced once again a complete social boycott. When on his second day on board, with the ship still in port, the sneering first engineer accused him of arriving late to his shift and picked a quarrel. Kahn quit on the spot, leaving the ship and maritime work for good. Kahn's narration makes clear that this moment was the culmination of many years of growing self-confidence and racial consciousness, and the beginning of the end for Kahn's belief in the promise of American equality and opportunity. Interestingly, this loss of faith in the national myth was grounded in an equally strong faith in the cosmopolitanism of New York City. I was not surprised or offended by the racism on my previous ship, because the crew was from the southern part of the United States, and I had joined the ship at Norfolk, Virginia, where racial and color prejudice was rampant. But I did not expect such prejudice around the port of New York. Indeed, I was proud of New York and its cosmopolitan life, of which I always spoke very highly. I felt more confident in New York than in India. I had innumerable friends and acquaintances in the city from various walks of life. Thus, I was not willing to tolerate any racism or be looked down upon on account of my foreign birth or the color of my skin. I had suffered through nasty personal experiences in the past, and the additional treatment on this ship added insult to injury. Ironically, it was this incident that sent Kahn running from New York City, its waterfront, his friends, and his political work, to take the first job he could find in the industrial interior of the country. In this case, a job in a rail yard in Olean in far upstate New York. The move upstate initiated a series of events that gave Kahn a view of American racism that was thus clouded by his faith in the abstract promises of his adopted country. In Olean, he almost immediately found himself in an altercation and fistfight with a white coworker who referred to him as a little Hindu and threatened, "I shall kill you and send you back where you came from." When he took leave from his job for 2 months to pursue a course in small plane aviation in rural southern Illinois, Kahn was confronted by a local man with the handle of a gun protruding from his hip pocket, and who told him to leave this place on the next available train. he discovered that not a single Negro was allowed to work, live, or enter the vicinity of the town. Khan still felt compelled, when he met his aviation instructor, to insist that I am not a colored man, but come from India. At the same time, when he describes the lengths that his instructor now had to take in order to convince the owner of the town's hotel that he is not a Negro, Khan relates this act of racial distinction in a sarcastic rather than matter-of-fact tone. I presumed he was giving the owner a discourse in anthropology and probably sociology to convince the man that I was not a Negro and hence no outrage would be committed against the white race in renting me a room. After completing all the arrangements, he came back and, smiling triumphantly, announced his formidable achievement. By the time that Khan, resting in an Indiana hospital room after crashing his plane on a test flight, looking out his window to see a white-hooded phalanx of the Ku Klux Klan marching through the town's main street, he had already come to a clearer understanding of his position in the United States' racial hierarchies, closer to Negroes than to the white shipmates he had once tried to cure of their illness, and his belief in America had been deeply shaken. It was in this state that Khan came to rejoin his network of Indian ex-sailors in the Detroit neighborhood of Black Bottom, where he went through a final transition in his understanding of race and racism in the United States. Khan and the other Indian Muslim seafaring men living in Detroit in 1925 had come to the city at a significant moment for its African American residents. Marcus Garvey's influence in Detroit and in black communities across the United States was at its height, and this year, after appeals against manufactured charges of mail fraud failed, Garvey was sent to jail. Also, in 1925, Deuce Muhammad Ali, a Sudanese-Egyptian Pan-Africanist and advisor to Garvey, began holding Muslim meetings and prayer services in Detroit that brought African American and immigrant Muslims together within the same organization, the Universal Islamic Society. These meetings, which were attended by some of the city's Indian ex-seamen, may have influenced the development of two of the most important African American Muslim groups, the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam. Finally, 1925 was the year in which an African American doctor, Ossian Sweet, went on trial for murder after he and his friends took up arms to defend his new home in a previously white Detroit neighborhood from a violent mob. While Dr. Sweet's case garnered widespread national attention, it was a particularly strong rallying point for Detroit's own African American community, which included thousands of residents of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley who were recent migrants from the segregated South. Khan and other Indian Muslim seamen were living near the heart of Detroit's African American community on the east side of downtown Detroit at this moment of cultural and political ferment. No doubt, many of the men from the subcontinent kept to their own circles, living and socializing among Indian ex-seafarers and immigrant immigrant Muslim auto workers in their pocket of rooming houses on East Congress, Fort, and Lafayette streets. As in New Orleans, however, a number of Indians married African American women and moved further into the residential center of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, to the north and east of the immigrant boarding house district. British surveillance documents from the period show that Detroit's British consul was keeping a close eye on this smaller group of more settled Indian ex-seamen. While the consul eventually expressed concern that the Lascars were a radical element within a local Indian nationalist organization, the United India League of America, his first worry seems to have been that the ex-seamen had married colored women and were associating with members of the large influx of colored people from the South, gaining the negative attention of local authorities and bringing disrepute to a group of Indian students then attending Michigan State University. It is unclear exactly where Khan himself took up residence in 1925. It appears to have been in or near the immigrant boarding house district, but he was quickly drawn to Black Bottom's cultural and entertainment district and pulled into the local African American community's unfolding political activism. In his memoir, Khan describes for the first time having the opportunity to get in close contact with American Negroes and to appreciate their difficulties. This brought about a revived political interest. Khan now made full use of his free time every week by attending political, educational, or social meetings. He learned about the militant Marxist organization, the African Blood Brotherhood, its newspaper, The Crusader, Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, and Black Star Line, and more generally, the frustrations of black ex-servicemen who returned to face unemployment and increasing racial violence after the war. From his jail cell in India years later, Dada Khan wrote about this moment with passion, calling the United Negro Improvement Association the only organization worth its name at the time, and expressing admiration for the self-sufficiency of the African American community in Detroit, which included both workers and already a middle-class educated section such as lawyers, doctors, dentists, preachers, teachers, journalists, and some property and house owners. As a whole, the community were holding their own. Khan writes of two key figures who brought him into contact with many political-minded Negroes in Detroit. The first was a roommate, whom Khan describes as a South Indian who was brought up by American missionaries in the USA. Although he does not specify the race of his roommate's adoptive parents, it is clear that as an adult, this South Indian was living in the black community and active within its church circles. The roommate began taking Khan to Negro churches in the neighborhoods where, in Khan's words, African Americans led a segregated life as untouchables have to do in India. Visits to services and meetings in these churches apparently became a part of Khan's routine for the months he lived in Detroit. The second person who introduced Khan to black political circles was Deuce Muhammad Ali. Historian Richard Brent Turner has described Deuce Muhammad as a prominent member of London's Muslim community in the 1910s, who became Marcus Garvey's mentor in Pan-Africanism. Deuce Muhammad had published a journal, the African Times and Orient Review, from 1912 to 1920, in which he published many articles on Islam in the British Empire, particularly in India, and developed a political vision that fused Pan-Africanism, anti-imperialism, and Pan-Islamic unity. In the 1920s, he came to the United States and eventually settled in Detroit. Dada Khan does not detail how he first came in contact with Deuce Muhammad Ali. It may have been through some of the other Indian Muslims in Detroit who had begun attending the meetings and prayer services that Deuce Muhammad was conducting under the auspices of a newly formed Islamic society. Khan was impressed by the diversity of this group, in which Indians participated side by side with African, Arab, and African American Muslims. He was also drawn to Deuce Muhammad's ideas of mutual help among the different oppressed peoples. The Sudanese Egyptian, writes Khan, had started an organization at Detroit to develop the worldwide commercial relations between all the colonial, semi-colonial, and oppressed people, and had collected around him some middle-class Negro supporters of his plan apart from some Negro working people. What is interesting in Khan's account, however, is his suspicion both of Deuce Muhammad's reliance on religion as the primary unifying force for oppressed peoples and of the elder figure's underlying motives. Identifying more with his black neighbors and co-workers than with his Muslim co-religionist, Khan thought it wrong that Dost Muhammad Ali would take the hard-earned money of Negro working people in subscription fees to support his commercial schemes. Khan's relationship with Dost Muhammad, in other words, stands out not only, as Khan says, for the opportunity it provided for him to come to know many more Negroes in Detroit, but also as an indication of his own sharpening political vision, in which Khan increasingly came to see the importance of global solidarity based not on religion, but on the shared and overlapping oppression of the racialized, the colonized, and the wage slave. This vision, rooted in Khan's experiences as a maritime worker and an industrial worker, a colonial subject of British India, and a racialized subject in the United States, came together in Detroit as Khan witnessed the grassroots African American movement in support of Ocean Sweet. Khan appears to have developed a strong connection to Detroit's working-class black community by the time of the Sweet trial, and was swept into the event, attending informational and support meetings in black churches and community spaces, much as he had attended similar events in support of Indian independence in New York 5 years before. Khan was deeply moved by what he saw. There was all sorts of string-pulling going on behind the scene to hinder Sweet's defense, and thus to deprive the accused of a fair trial. Negroes in the USA, who were fully aware of the whites' treatment of their race, rose to the occasion throughout the country. Negro groups did not leave any stone unturned to rally the race in defense of the accused. Describing one packed meeting that he attended, in the company of my South Indian friend, at Detroit's historic Second Baptist Church, Khan writes that speaker after speaker poured out his heart to the audience in the most moving speeches. Then, when the appeal was made for contributions for Dr. Sweet's defense fund, Khan continues, everyone contributed whatever they could. By me were sitting some Negro working women of different ages. When the collection basket came, those who had no cash with them took off their earrings, finger rings, or whatever else they had to contribute toward the defense funds. That day I saw how, in face of a common danger, the Negro community stood united in defense of a man of their race. Haider Khan's description of the sustained organizing efforts of the African American community around Sweet's case makes clear that his experience of this time deepened his understanding of both the violent and the institutional sides of American racism, demonstrated to him what was possible when people came together around a common cause across various lines of difference. In this case, class, age, and gender consolidated his racial and political identification with African Americans, and ultimately stretched his own politics beyond the realm of anti-British, anti-imperialism to an internationalism that was inspired by and rooted in his witness of African American popular protest. Ultimately, Khan's decision to pursue political training in the Soviet Union later in 1925 appears to have been as catalyzed by his experience of African American anti-racist organizing as by his experiences as a worker or his meetings with the Soviet representatives who recruited him. Dada Amir Haider Khan was clearly an extraordinary figure, both in terms of the incredible breadth of his travels, encounters, and experiences over the course of the 7 years that followed his desertion from the SS Khiva in 1918, and in terms of the written record he left behind. This is precisely why Khan's account is so important, not because it represents from beginning to end the exact trajectory that other Indian Muslims followed in the 1910s and 1920s, but because it provides a picture of so many of the different pathways that Indian seamen took and so many of the places they lived and worked. After jumping ship in New York City in 1918, almost everywhere Conn went, and in almost everything he did, there were other Indian ex-seamen who were there or who had been there before him. On the New York waterfront, in its boarding houses and Indian-run restaurants and laundries, in the meetings of the FFI in New York City and the United India League of America in Detroit, in the American Merchant Marine, in munition factories in New Jersey, railway workshops and steel foundries in New Jersey and upstate New York, and auto factories in Michigan, in black bottom rooming houses and Paradise Valley homes, in black churches and in the prayer meetings of Deuce Muhammad Ali's Islamic Society in Detroit, in all these spaces through which Conn's trajectory passed, there were other Indian ex-seamen. His story thus gives us a sense of the possibilities that were open to Indian seafaring men as they moved through onshore networks in the United States, the pathways they followed and carved out, the spaces in which they lived, worked, and interacted, the encounters both within and outside Indian circles that were unique to their trajectories, and the transformations that were possible in the ways they saw themselves and the world. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please make sure to share your opinions down in the comments. I would love to know what you guys think of these excerpts. Also, please do like this video and subscribe to my channel so you could continue on reading with me, and also just to see all my other videos too.